Good evening from the Foreign Correspondents Club in Hong Kong. My name is Austin Ramsey, and I'm a reporter with the New York Times. Thank you for joining us for a talk on startups and Substack, how to build your media brand during a pandemic. Before we begin, I'd like to mention a few upcoming events we have at the FCC. On Monday, October 25th, there will be a showing of the new documentary Ghosts of Afghanistan, which follows war correspondent Graham Smith as he travels through the conflict-weary nation just before the return of the Taliban to power, in search of how everything went so wrong. Then on Tuesday, October 26th, we will have an online book talk with Michael Sheridan, whose new work, The Gate to China, offers a definitive look at Hong Kong and its relationship with the mainland, tracing an arc of history from the earliest days of trade through the Opium Wars, a handover from Britain to China, and the eventual descent from protest to authoritarian-style rule. Also ongoing at the club this month in the main bar is a display of photos by Danish Siddiqui, the acclaimed Reuters journalist who was killed in Afghanistan earlier this year. More details on all those events and others are available on our website, fcchk.org. Now to tonight's talk. The coronavirus pandemic upended the world of work and threw inequality into sharp relief. At the same time, it has also presented a unique set of difficulties for the media industry, which was already suffering from declining ad revenue and readership. In Asia, however, smaller outfits are finding ways to keep their business models alive. What does it take to keep a startup running in uncertain times? What are some tactics to boost engagement? And how can journalists expand their individual platforms' presence in the region? It's my pleasure to welcome three guests tonight to discuss those questions and more. Erin Cook writes Dari Mulut, a weekly newsletter following developing stories and emerging trends from across Southeast Asia. The newsletter is particularly focused on ASEAN and relations between members, as well as youth movements and elections. Erin is also a freelance writer whose work can be found in the Lowy Institute's Interpreter, Coconut's Indonesia Intelligencer, and The Diplomat. Tanmoy Goswami is founding editor of Sanity by Tanmoy, India's first independent mental health journalism platform. Tanmoy also co-facilitates suicide reporting workshops for journalists and speaks to medical students and business leaders about the many intersections of mental health. Before turning to mental health journalism, Tanmoy headed the editorial desk at Fortune India magazine. Alan Soon started Splice Media to help drive the transformation of Asia's media industry, and he believes that we are in a golden age of media in which the mass media model is being replaced by niche startups serving smaller but highly engaged communities. Splice's mission is to support the growth and sustainability of these media startups across Asia by reporting on their work, training them, and advising them as consultants. Alan has worked in media for over 2 decades, including radio, TV, newswires, a magazine, and online. Moderating today's talk is Jennifer Creery. She is a journalist with the Financial Times and was this past year a Clare Hollingworth Fellow at the FCC. Please send any questions to the email address question@fcc.org. That's question singular. I'll turn it over to Jennifer.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Austin, and welcome everyone to tonight's discussion on how to build your media brand during a pandemic. And we've got a great selection of guests. So without further ado, let's dive straight in. Erin, I want to start by asking you about your very popular newsletter, Dari Mulut, which covers Southeast Asia, a huge region of, I believe, nearly 650 million people, right? But you started this project in 2016, well before the coronavirus pandemic. What triggered you to start this, and how has your audience changed or grown in the years since you began this project?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, first of all. Very happy to be here. I'm a huge fan of all the media workers in Hong Kong, so it's brilliant to have a chat today. So thanks, guys. So I started Dari Mulut in 2016 when I was a copy editor at one of the daily newspapers in Jakarta, which is a fantastic job for meeting people and getting to know and understand one of the biggest cities in not just the region, but in the world. But it doesn't offer so much in, I don't know, future careers. So at the time, there were a few writers that I was really, really interested in who had set up Tiny Letter, which was kind of a precursor almost to MailChimp and Substack and these new platforms we have now. And that was growing in popularity. So I thought I'd give one of those a go. I think a lot of the issues we see now as media workers during the pandemic were already issues in 2016. So these trying to build a career when sort of these traditional paths were no longer open, not so much, you do your cadetship and then you do your 5 years out in the regions and then you get to go on a great foreign correspondence posting. The newsletter was kind of a way to build my own sort of entry-level steps. Luckily, 2016 was a deeply fascinating time for Southeast Asia, so that really, really helped, I think, build an audience that maybe would have been a bit harder to find. I definitely got helped a lot by President Duterte winning the election in the Philippines, which opened up a lot of interest outside of the region to what was going on in Southeast Asia. But as newsletters have become more and more popular, and when I personally wanted to switch over to the paid option, which Substack offered, I did that in late 2017. And that was motivated partially by losing this fantastic job at the paper, but also wanting to have a bit more flexibility about the options. Up until then, freelancing has been really hard. It's kind of, you do your same 4 stories on Indonesia and hopefully a new editor comes in and you get to do that again. By going paid subscription, it means that I can really hone in on these stories that wouldn't get a run anywhere else. And I can connect directly with the audiences that understand that and are looking for that sort of thing. So that's definitely one of the major advantages, I think, to going the newsletter path rather than sort of sticking with the traditional outlets.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, reading your newsletter, the kind of language that you use, I find is very casual. It's very conversational. And do you find that strategy really helped to engage audiences and readers? Was that something intentional, that you wanted the writing to be accessible?
Absolutely. I think it's a very hard audience to write to. I know that there's a portion of the audience that are extraordinarily engaged, who are either who call parts of the region home and have grown up, without needing to have who President Jokowi is explained to them. But there are also readers that have backgrounds in, Vietnam or the Philippines or Singapore, who may need these sort of more casual and informative approaches. It's as you were saying, it's a huge region to cover. And I think it's easier to approach it casually, but still seriously, rather than these sort of academic tones that is not always warranted, I think.
Yeah, and it's been a good 5 years since you started this. Was it you were kind of building your presence slowly throughout that period? Was there a particular time where you really saw your kind of audience engagement spike, and what did you do to ensure that you had continued readership during that period?
I think that one of the, apart from the times where I've had friends and sort of colleagues in the media community, people like Alan and Richard from Splice, kind of pushing and supporting the newsletter, which have always given me sort of spikes in new members, new readers, but also huge events, particularly the Jakarta gubernatorial election in 2017, and more recently at the start of this year with the crisis in Myanmar. Huge international incidents like that are a big driver of new subscribers.
Yeah,
which I think is a testament to how difficult it is for, if you're outside of the region, to find sort of work that can give you the context to fully understand the issue.
Yeah, I want to go back to looking at kind of the more successful business models that you found have worked for you. But I want to shift a little bit to go to Tanmoy, and just because you've had a very interesting and perhaps difficult journey over the past. year or two, and one which I think many pandemic workers will relate to. Just as a recap, your newsletter focuses on the global mental health movement, and you've said that that specifically is focused on the marginalization of low and middle income countries. Can you tell us how Sanity came to be?
Sure, thank you. Terrific to be in Hong Kong from Delhi. Sanity is, so when I decided to call this space Sanity, I remember one of my former colleagues at the Correspondent, which is where I worked until the pandemic kind of felled it in December. She asked me, this sounds like a perfume brand. And I said, that's great because we do need some distraction from all this stink that this year has generated. I think I called myself the world's first sanity correspondent when I was at the Correspondent, and that was a very conscious choice because having been a business journalist in India all my life, 16, 17 years as a business journalist, and also a user survivor, somebody with lived experience of mental health challenges, I realized that mental health, even before the pandemic, actually 2017, 2018, around that time was already beginning to get a little hot. And that was driven primarily by the inflow of venture capital. Money had just started flowing in, though nothing of the kind that we see today. It was also becoming politically very relevant, which was surprising. In India in 2017, we got a very radical new law, which brought physical health and mental health on a par. And that was really very inspiring for a lot of us. So I had the sense that it was all going to add up to something very momentous, but I didn't quite know how it would play out. And then in 26, at around the same time, I was also, I had to take a forced break from work because of my depression. In 2018, I became a father, and that was really the year when I decided that I had to work in this full time, that I couldn't just, write one LinkedIn post or a few tweets chronicling my experience. And so when the Correspondent came along, I kind of jumped at the opportunity, and those 18 months really showed me that there was an appetite for this kind of journalism globally, and very few outlets around the world were doing this full time. That they had a full time beat dedicated to mental health. So when in December the Correspondent shut down, I had no strategy really, no plan. I just wanted to stay in touch with my readers, and that's how Sanity started as a Substack newsletter in December of 2020. Within 100 days, it became one of the top paid health-related newsletters on Substack. And then eventually, earlier this year, I was selected to a course in CUNY, the entrepreneurial journalism course, which then propelled me to start my own website. So as of today, I've moved away from Substack, and Sanity has its own site.
Now, do you think that Sanity would exist in its current form without the pandemic?
Yeah, interesting question. I think I would say Sanity would definitely exist, but I think the urgency that a lot of the issues that I tackle have acquired would have been impossible without the pandemic. Because I have very consciously positioned Sanity as a political and economic and cultural, journalism platform, not just a biomedical or a pharma-driven, approach. So definitely issues like inequality, injustice, and the appreciation that mental health is not an exclusively health sector problem has been driven home very ruckusly by the pandemic. So to that extent, I think, yes, the current form is inspired greatly by the pandemic. But I think as a secular trend, mental health was already becoming quite big. So a platform like this would have existed in some form.
Yeah. And of course, mental health predates the pandemic, but the pandemic, hopefully, at least I think we all hope that the pandemic will come to an end at some point. What do you think Sanity will look like after the pandemic? I know that you said that you specifically, you've created it so that there's a focus on kind of political and social issues as well. But what will it look like post-pandemic, whenever that is?
Right now, I'm really putting my head down and focusing on making this sustainable. And so that's my number one agenda, really. And there are many issues there, which maybe we'll talk about later. But I think my ultimate goal is to, there is this lament in the global South that the global North does not listen to us. And, all this research on mental health that happens in all these universities are exclusively based on North American and European populations. The funding does not go into areas that are most critically in need of money and all of these things. And I feel like it's time we stop cribbing about that and really create our own idiom and our own community. We don't really need to have validation from the global North. We can create our own networks of solidarity. And that's really what I want Sanity to play a role catalyzing, is to try and lead that conversation, which is very authentic, very rooted in lived realities in our part of the world, and unabashedly independent, ad-free, hopefully. Let's see how that goes.
Just thinking about inequality, I read an interview that you did about how you're talking about the newsletter boom a few years ago, and how it's quote largely restricted to white Western male writers producing work on business and technology with some politics. But of course there are writers outside of that who focus on anything from gender to cultural issues. In your opinion, do you think that there is a market for that kind of content and an appetite for it that is monetizable? In other words, can newsletter writers who touch on those topics, can they keep their newsletters afloat?
I mean, I want to say yes with every fiber of my being, but that's not really a very realistic answer. I think it's very difficult. The only way to survive is literally to think of survival and not think of like outlandish growth. This is something I've made peace with, and I'm happy with that. I've already put a cap on how much I can grow this, and I'm perfectly happy with that, because in many ways, when you write about mental health, a lot of which is a lot of it sounds a lot like activism. And that kind of puts a lot of growth pundits, and it makes them a little uneasy. Funders, etc., will typically not touch your platform if you take very opinionated stands on things, especially in our part of the world. So you've got to make a very conscious choice, and you've got to be happy with the fact that this may never become $1 million empire, and that's all right. If it touches the lives of 10,000 people, which is also a very, very large number, I'm happy. So, and when I said that, the creator economy, and I truly believe that the creator economy is basically, to me, a fancier way of reviving the American dream. And I can expound on that later, but it is rigged against creators who are not from the US or Europe for multiple reasons. So yeah.
Erin, is that something that you resonate with, the idea that it's a lot of the time it's about survival rather than growth?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think that's a super, super interesting point. I've been thinking a lot lately about subscription fatigue, which is this idea that, during the pandemic, everybody signed up to so many different services, whether it's streaming services or couple of different newsletters or what have you. And I noticed that it's had an impact on me, and just talking with a lot of the other Substack writers and the other platforms around the region, there's been a huge drop in new people joining the subscription. But I think that that's the best way to see it, that there is going to be sort of a ceiling, and that ceiling may be lower during the pandemic, but it still will exist. And you're not going to turn into Rupert Murdoch, thankfully, on an email server. So I loved that. That was a great point. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly resonate with that. At the FT, I write a newsletter as well, and at the beginning of the pandemic, saw a huge spike in subscribers, and as the pandemic wore on, you could definitely see a drop in the number of people engaging, the number of open rates, things like that. But Alan, I want to move on to you. I want to get your perspective on how the region is doing in terms of developing new business models. What was different about the media ecosystem in this part of the world pre-pandemic, and how has the pandemic changed that? Can you give us an overview just to understand where we are?
Yeah, this is actually, one of my favorite topics because, as you well know, we are quite the optimists when it comes to media in this space. We think that, even prior to the pandemic, a lot of changes that we wanted to see were already starting to happen. The pandemic was a great accelerator of those changes, and I think, so last year, just as the pandemic hit, or rather, at the onset of it. We ran a survey to find out exactly how the pandemic was hitting newsrooms, whether jobs were being cut, whether there were options to shift fixed costs, and how would you try to run your operations as you had to move to remote operations. At that time, it was a pretty bleak picture. This was when advertising was going off a cliff. This was when no one quite knew how to run a business remotely. And look at where we are now. We are here doing a video call all across the region in something that's become second nature to us, jumping on a Zoom call, strange and crazy as it sounds. But that's exactly where we are now. So what we want to do next year is to run a survey again, just to see how much has changed and whether it was for the better. I have a hunch that it was probably net positive in the end, with everything said and done as far as newsroom operations go, because now we've learned to live with lower fixed costs. A lot of newsrooms have given up their offices because they realize they don't really need them anymore. They realize that they can do a lot of interviews on Zoom. They can expand their base of sources that they want to reach. You can also reach your members far more effectively through all these new tools that we've all grown accustomed to. So I think there's going to be a net positive outcome when all of this is said and done. I think the acceleration and pushing newsrooms to adopt new technologies and workflows has been really, really powerful. It's forced someone like Tanmoy to go explore what was available on Substack, and for Erin as well. Like, all these tools were there, like in Erin's case, even before the pandemic hit. And because of the pandemic, a lot of journalists have discovered new ways to engage audiences, and I think this is really a good thing.
And I know this is an impossible question. I'm asking you to look into a crystal ball, but what does the increasing kind of shift online mean for subscribers and readers? We saw declining readership pre-pandemic, and Erin mentioned and Tanmoy mentioned that people might get fatigued. Do you think that that's a real threat, and how will the dynamic between news organizations and readers change? Do you think there's a real threat of fatigue?
Well, yes and no. It is a hard question, but let me try to explain it this way. I think what's really unique about Erin and Tanmoy is that these are both creators entering a new creator space, a creator economy that is building up right before our very eyes, right? The creator economy is something that has really started taking off over the past 2 years. The pandemic had a huge part to play in this, right? The one thing that you'll realize about their subscribers is that not all of them would have subscribed. Not all of them would subscribe just for the content alone, right? There are many cases out there when it comes to the creator economy where people are subscribing not because they want to read more articles or watch more videos or listen to more podcasts. They do it because they believe that this is the way forward and this is how they show their support for people like Tanmoy and Erin. And I think this is really an important shift. This is a kind of affinity and support that big newsrooms and big newspapers don't see at all, because it just feels too far a reach to be done. But the pandemic has really shown what can be done when you start something on Substack, when you start something on Patreon, when you start something on OnlyFans. Like all of these are options that are viable now. You can tip the people that you want to support. You can put down your credit card so that they get a recurring revenue every month for the support that you want to give them. Like all of these things are possible now that wasn't possible, or we didn't even really think about it 3 years ago. So you have the pandemic to thank for that one.
It sounds like what you're touching on is loyalty, reader loyalty. And Erin and Tanmoy, I can see you're nodding your heads. Is that something that you feel from readers? Do you get feedback from them? Is it something? And I guess I'm curious. Is there any way of measuring that loyalty, or is it just a feeling that you have with your readership? Either one of you.
I think in Tanmoy's case, it might be more because of the subject matter. You'd be those sort of conversations are a bit more welcomed. But in my case, I'm very happy to hear Alan say that, because sometimes it does feel like you're sending out these emails into the ether, and you hear back if you made some sort of error. But at the same time, I cannot believe how lucky I am in this in this economy and in this media industry to be able to make any sort of living, even if it's effectively a part-time income. Alan putting it like that really puts it into perspective of what that sort of what the transaction actually is. It's not just here's my money, here's your product sort of thing. It is, it's a relationship between a reader and a creator.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, I'm just extremely lucky to have a super engaged bunch. And once again, I've long given up the idea of measuring engagement the conventional way, because I ever since I moved from Substack to Ghost, I stopped looking at open rates. In fact, my entire site is set up to not throw up any kind of data. I have extensively invested in privacy preserving tools. I don't use Google Analytics. I have paid handsome money to make sure that I both respect my readers' privacy and don't lose sleep over tracking every little piece of data that comes out. Having said that, let me give you some concrete numbers which might actually help contextualize what this means. So before a new payments regulation hit in Indian startups, which is a different story altogether, I was on track to $1,500 in monthly recurring revenue, which is a senior editor's salary in India. Now that doesn't go very far if you are, not a spring chicken. I'm not a spring chicken, so it doesn't go very far, unfortunately. But the site is paying for itself and throwing up a bit of surplus. I have 2,100 subscribers, which is for a site that does not look at mental health through the lenses of the usual sort of 7 ways to beat stress kind of stuff, is quite something. And this is all dispersed across the world. Now, given that we all building all of these things out of nothing. None of this existed. So I completely echo what Alan said. This is all a net positive. And none of this would have been possible if people were only paying or only looking at these relationships as subscriptions, because that tends to be very transactional. I often hear from people, and some of my regular readers are also regular donors. So they have subscribed and then they keep donating every 3 months or so. And I know that, they don't end up reading 100% of what I produce. So that's a very strong endorsement of what Alan said.
That's really interesting. For my newsletter, I get totally, immersed in looking at the page views, the open rate, the click rates, or all these metrics. It's really interesting that you have that approach to, tracking your readership. Erin, do you ever get lost in the numbers? Being obsessed with tracking who's opening, how many people are opening, and things like that.
I've been thinking about this a lot lately, actually, because I go through, I think, maybe phases where sometimes it goes down, open rates go down for whatever reason, and then they go up again, and I try to work out why exactly. But what I really like about Substack and a lot of these other platforms is that I'm not a tech person. I don't know how any of this sort of works. I just want to sit there and write 1,500 words on what ASEAN's going to do. And what I really like about sort of this way of doing things is you can just ignore it and base the metrics on your own value that you're getting out of it. Or you can get in touch with people like Alan at Splice. You can sort of point you in the right direction. Or a few of the other creators. I know Stuart McDonald, who does Travel Fish, he's very, very into that sort of thing. And every now and then, if I'm thrown by, some number falling off a cliff for 2 weeks, he's the first person to get in touch with, because he uses these platforms and he understands those sorts of concepts. So building these sort of communities of creators is really, really important, I think, beyond just not feeling lonely because you're not in a newsroom, but there's a lot of value in that as well.
And you've all mentioned various platforms like Tiny Letter and Substack. To what extent do you think that the so-called newsletter boom owes its success to these new delivery models? What do you think, any of you three?
Well, I think newsletters have been around for a while now. This is known as, I guess, in many circles, as a granddaddy of the media scene. It's something that's easily accessible. It's something that everybody knows how to use, because we all know how to use an inbox. There's no mystery there. So that's always been there. But I think what's really different now is that you see how Substack had a huge part to play in it, but it's not going to be the final story in this equation. You see that Facebook has been entering this space with headline or something. They have, yeah, exactly. Well, they're probably going to change the name as well, aren't they? So you see newsletters being a part now of every major CMS that's coming out. The one that Tanmoy uses, Ghost, has newsletters built into it. You see this also built into Squarespace, for example, which was traditionally an e-commerce platform. Emails is just one component of how you reach an audience and how you reach your customers. And so we're just going to see this picking up speed over time. It's so easy to get started. In many cases, it's also free, right? So if you're starting up on MailChimp, you get to use that for free until you hit a certain number of users. So a lot of these things have become are free, easily accessible. Plenty of great instructional videos to learn from as well. All of this stuff has become so accessible that it's just this is just table stakes now for any creator trying to build an audience.
That's really interesting. Before I move on to the next question, I just want to remind our audience to please send questions in to question@fcchk.org. That's question singular at fcchk.org. But moving on from what you said, Alan, about how easy it is to start a newsletter now, I think a question for all of you as well. Do you think that people see this this job as a long-term career choice? Is it something that you can see lasting for a few years? Erin, perhaps?
I think I definitely see it as a long-term thing. For one, I've been doing it for a while, so I kind of can't really see not doing it for a while. And also living and working in Jakarta for so long as a foreigner, you come across Kevin O'Rourke often, who does the Reformasi newsletters, and he's been doing that I don't even know how long, but he wrote a book about Suharto, so I'm kind of expect it to be all the way back in '98. He's been doing it for a long, long time, and he's got a fantastic career because of it. As well as Bill Bishop, who's one of I think the first fellow who popped up on Substack. People like that show that there are, long careers in this sort of thing. But it's got to be consistent. You've got to really carve out your niche. I keep seeing these new ones pop up, and it's, 5 links that I read this week. And it's like, I've already read one of those. So you've got to really pick something. And then I think you can continue to have a long career in it.
And how do you, thinking about, finding your niche, how can you see if that niche is successful, or if there's appetite for that niche? Presumably it's very difficult to start a project like this up from the ground up. Tanmoy, I'm thinking about you specifically. How did you identify that niche and that there was appetite for that in the first place?
I didn't even think about that question, honestly, because this was the only thing that I could do. There was no other topic that I was an expert on. Well, there was business journalism, but that's something that is already kind of saturated here and globally. So it was not so much a strategic decision as, this is something that really helped me heal as a person who's lived with mental health challenges. The great thing about newsletter writing is that you're essentially writing for a market of one. You're writing to yourself, and then 10 people join in, and then word of mouth, something happens. It's all very mystifying, really. It's also, I think, what I have learned over time is that often journalists and people who've spent a lot of time in the media, we're so besotted by this journalist designation. We're so starry-eyed. The whole world will tell us that your industry is dying, but we still want to cling to the media, and as if there is no other socially acceptable form of livelihood. This requires a lot of untraining if you have to make a successful career out of doing this, because one of the first things that Jeremy Kaplan at CUNY taught us was, diversify, diversify, diversify. If you're going to be hung up on just getting money from your subscribers and building this utopian ship, it's going to sink. So you've got to, do your consulting gigs, the occasional freelance, whatever it takes to keep this afloat. And then the other thing is that, I also picked up during that course that journalists are so obsessed nowadays with this idea of creating communities. Everybody wants to create a community, but communities already exist. Communities have existed before you started writing your newsletter. You've got to find those communities and find out how to best serve their needs. And that mantra has really helped me, because I was spending a lot of time trying to create this unique brand around Sanity, and how do I create this loyal community? And then I realized, no, people who've been living with mental health challenges, caregivers, policymakers, researchers, funders, are already there. I just got to find what they most need and serve those needs. And that's difficult as a one-person outfit, but it's much easier than creating a brand new community.
Alan, do you agree?
Absolutely agree. This is music to my ears. These communities do exist. People already gather and people already communicate in some form or other. It might be a WhatsApp group. It might be, a Facebook group. All these things do exist. And the challenge here and the opportunity really is for every journalist to go out there and think, this is my constituency. This is what I'm going to do to serve them. And also, to your earlier point of whether newsletters are just a phase and whether this will pass. Just remember that newsletters, like all things, it's just a container. It's just a format. Formats can change, right? So if Erin were to do a documentary series, I'd go watch it for sure. If Tanmoy did a podcast, I would definitely be up for it. I would follow them because I care about what they're talking about. And I think that's the stuff that matters. So the container will change, and it needs to change. And, who knows? This could be a Netflix movie at some point, right? For Tanmoy.
Well, thinking about your organization, Splice, do you think that there's enough support for people like Erin and Tanmoy in the region?
I think I'd like to say the short answer is no, because I think that there needs to be more effort being put in to think of them as journalists / creators. I think very often, you remember what it was like when, let's say 10 years ago, when YouTubers started arriving on the scene, and we were also quick to dismiss them as journalists because we said, look at these guys, they might be good with a mic kit and lights and all that, but what do they know, right? They're not like us. And then influencers came on board, and they started to galvanize communities in the millions, and we were outside of the conversation because we were just incapable of reaching the audiences that really cared about some of these subject matters, right? And here we are now. We're entering into this phase of the creator economy where these things do matter, and the tools are available now for people like Tanmoy and Erin to go out there and build and create ways to engage the communities that they serve. Like, all of these things exist now, and this is really great to see. I would like to see more conversations, in that space around how can we, as an older journalism community, learn from creators, from YouTubers, from influencers. How do we go about building content that really engages on these platforms? And then on top of that, learn how to monetize the way they do. These YouTubers and influencers and creators, a lot of them make a lot of money for good reason, because they know how to build and engage their communities with products that people want.
That's really interesting that you say that. On the Splice website, it says that it started because, quote, the media wasn't making the most of the arrival of the internet. What do you think triggered that, this kind of innovation, looking at different ways to really engage with audiences? Specifically, what did you mean by that? And do you think that has changed?
Trying to recall when I wrote that. That sounds like something I would have written about 10 years ago, probably over a beer. But I think for me, the challenge that I have with media is that our understanding of media is counted in millions in terms of mass audiences. Everything that has been built for the past 5 decades in TV and in radio and newspapers has always been, how many people, how many eyeballs can I throw in front of this ad? And that was the entire business model, right? And that worked for a very long time. And the difference with the internet is that the internet's completely different. It's not about going after a mass model, a mass audience. It's about finding the niche audiences that you can serve and serve them really well. And by niche, I don't mean small. I mean very, very specific things that people care about, like mental health, for example, like what's going on in ASEAN. These are very niche, but very, very deep. And these can serve, thousands of people at a go. And I think that's the important thing there. My struggle is always when, this whole narrative about media dying is really about the collapse of a mass media industrial complex that's been built over decades, to serve large advertisers, which was great, and to deliver, millions of eyeballs in front of those ads. And that was the entire business model. And for a while it worked. And now with the internet, it's completely different, right? The opportunity for all of us is to find ways to serve very, very niche audiences where they stand and to give them what they want.
But do you think that it's not just finding niche audiences, but also the dynamic between media outlets and audiences have changed, i.e. there's more direct engagement, like Erin and Tanmoy mentioned. Do you think that that's also a factor?
Yeah, I think a lot of that has changed. When did Facebook first arrive? It must have been 8-9 years ago. I think our expectation of what is information has changed dramatically. One of the reasons why I love Erin's newsletter so much is that it gives me a point of view. It gives me a point of view. It makes me smile. It makes me go, yeah, I see what you did there. Social media has taught us that there's so much content out there, and you need a way to understand it better, right? You need someone to break it down for you, to give you a snarky response sometimes, and also to give you a really smart point of view. And that's the difference in relationships these days, I think. Anyone who's grown up in the past 15 years, who's grown up as a digital native, expects to have an opinion, a point of view put across to them. This is how news is being consumed now. And if we're not in that space and we're not learning how to engage with these audiences, we're missing out on a huge opportunity.
I guess a question to both Erin and Tanmoy. How active is your engagement with readers? Do they give your story ideas? Do they give you any story ideas, or do they push your coverage in one way or another? And I think a third question, do you have a comment section or a way for your readers to contact you? And do you find that to be a healthy dynamic? Either one of you.
I find with my audience, I think I
think Erin's frozen.
got a really there we go. Is that better?
Yep, you were back.
Excellent. Oh, there it's just popped up. Unstable. Yeah, a lot of like older retired former diplomats and NGO workers and that sort of thing. And I love hearing from them. They've always got not so much story ideas, just like oh, you mentioned this. Here's something that happened, in '84. Deep dive on that, just for your own information, which is brilliant. That's really, really helpful, useful sort of stuff. I try to move away so much from, I do have a comment section, but it takes a bit, I'm not afraid to delete comments is how I put it. I think there's, I'm a one-woman operation. There's some very funny laws around the region in which pre-pandemic I was traveling a lot, and I do not want to mess with any of that sort of stuff. And that's never, if you don't, the one downside of this sort of, I don't know, career, I guess, is that you don't have that sort of legal support, and I'm just not going to come near playing with any of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I completely hear you, Erin. It's been on my mind nonstop this past couple of weeks, because I've been wanting to tackle some topics that are slightly edgy, and I've been really biding my time because I don't have legal backing. I think that engagement of the kind that Jennifer was talking about, yes, this is very much the backbone of what I do. I would say 60% of in the last 20 months, including or 25 months, including the time I spent at the Correspondent. Yeah, 60% of the stories I've written have either directly or indirectly come out of my conversations with my readers. And some of them have been effectively co-authored by them. So it's very intentional for me. I already do two things very concretely, which help me keep in touch with them. I do these quarterly roundtables with my founding members and my paying supporters. These are like 2-3 hour long, just marathon chats where people just bring everything, all their impressions of the work I'm doing. If anything, I would like them to be a little more critical and snarky, which they aren't. They're just too nice. The other thing that I do is every quarter I publish a full financial report, a full, with complete transparency, how much I made, what I've spent the money on, what are my projections. This has become one of the more very, very, very popular feature, read by not just, as you can imagine, my readers, my subscribers, but the entire media fraternity community, because very, very few, forget about legacy media companies, very few even venture in that direction. It keeps me accountable and really, really drives engagement.
We do have one question from former FCC President Eric Wishart. And I think this is probably directed towards Alan. And that is, what percentage of the startups and Substack newsletters make money? And what separates the winners from the losers? Alan.
I wish I had that knowledge. My guess is that you would probably find that the best, in fact, I have seen this data somewhere. I think it was only about 2 months ago. This came up in Axios, I think. They did a simple breakdown to give a rough idea of who was making money and by how much. But I think the one thing you got to remember in trying to understand the economics of all this is some people do it to get rich. A lot of people do it to engage a community that they know exists. A lot of them do it because this is their, this is their calling, right? To write about something that you care a lot about and to be an expert in it. So when you look at the Casey Newtons of this world, I mean, that is often held up as the best example of how much money you can possibly make. And I think he's at six figures. I think if you look at Ben Thompson from Stratechery, he's also in six figures a year. So some of them make a lot of money, but the expertise that they have in these fields, that's phenomenal, right? So you're as good as your byline, you're good as your expertise. And also the other thing is you got to remember that these are single person operations, right? How much money do you need to run your household and to run your life is the question that you should also be thinking about. Tanmoy's got his hand up. I think you're going to jump in?
Yeah. I just wanted to add, when Alan was earlier talking about when Jennifer, you invoked Alan's 10-year-old this thing on his website about the internet not being used fully. A lot is made about the infinite sort of potential of the creator economy, and we think of the internet as a very homogeneous entity that exists across the world, but it really isn't. For creators in the global south, in Asia, in Africa, the challenges of monetization, for instance, forget about discovery. Once you've been discovered, then how do you monetize even a very loyal reader? The infrastructure is so broken that it's not a linear game, that you can't say, all right, after 5 newsletters, this reader is now hooked. They have the intent to pay, and it's just a simple matter of clicking a button and making that payment. In Nigeria, for instance, you can't even open a Patreon account, because the payment modalities don't work. In India right now, we're going through an absolute bloodbath in small subscriptions because of new regulations. So often we are anyway behind because the market is immature, because developing that willingness to pay in our readers is a time-consuming process. And then when people are ready to pay, whatever small percentage that is, they often meet these challenges that are built into these models that have been thought for an explicitly Western audience and a Western market. So, which is why I'm very, interested in, for instance, Scrollstack is a Substack competitor which was built out of India, and they are solving for these infrastructure problems. So we don't just need creators out of Asia and other regions, we also need infrastructure that is built out of these regions, so that we don't have to depend on, only Substack and Ghost and Tiny Letter.
Yeah, one thing that just struck me from what you were both saying is just, it sounds like there's a credible burden of responsibility on the individual when it comes to building up this media, this brand. Can I ask either Tanmoy or Erin, what is it like working without an editor? Is it liberating? Is it frightening? Do you feel a sense of imposter syndrome? How do you overcome that? Either of you?
I think it can be very difficult. I've often gotten a few messages from friends just being like, hey, keep an eye out on your commas, sort of thing. But it does also give you space to shape exactly what it is that you want to be doing, and flexibility to change that style if it no longer suits you. I've recently changed kind of my layout, I suppose, for the first time, like dramatically for the first time since I started this project. And it's no longer it's not boring to me anymore. I get to decide what I get to do. But the copy editing, I think, is the real issue. And I think that's also going to be a career path. That's going to be an option for a lot of copy editors that have found themselves put out of work as well. There's that many writers on these platforms now. They definitely need some editors on there too.
Yeah, I have been an editor most of my earlier career. I was an editor, and then only more recently a reporter. So I do understand the value that editors bring to the table, but personally for me, because I have understood the relationship I have with my readers, and I have set my expectations in terms of, the kind of topics I cover, etc. very clearly, I don't lose sleep over, am I putting out the most perfect version of the story? So that's been very liberating. I think what I really miss is having more allies really in close proximity, so that it helps. My partner, my wife, is an editor herself, so sometimes she'll look at stuff, but that the wait between sending the newsletter out and then waiting for the responses to pour in, that can sometimes be very excruciating. And then you sort of hope that you wish that you had somebody that you could just drag by their neck and make them sit in front of your computer and say, read my stuff and tell me it's good. But apart from that, I don't particularly, so far I haven't missed an editor so much.
I'll be honest, I can't relate to not losing any sleep. I mean, I lose sleep over typos that I've made 5 years ago. But just thinking about, Erin, you mentioned before that newsletters pop up all the time. What is it like as a competitive sphere? And aside from experience, which Tanmoy, you said you had experience as an editor and name recognition, how do you differentiate yourself, your newsletter, and your brand from others?
I think I'm in a very interesting spot in that I do the whole region. I don't do deeply into Singapore or deeply into Thailand or whatever. So I feel rather than being in direct competition, I'm more an allyship, I suppose, with other creators in the region, Vietnam Weekly, Campuchina out of Cambodia, We the Citizens out of Singapore, Travelfish, which does a lot of the region, and Slow News Day from the Philippines. The absolute geniuses behind those aren't direct competitors, I suppose, rather people that I can reach out to and discuss, what's this about? Are you covering this? So I see it as more of a social thing even rather than competition, because it's just not worth getting dragged down by it anymore. Like, I don't know. I miss my friends. It's been, 2 years. I miss everyone. So I'd rather, G everyone up than feel threatened by them.
And I guess looking forwards, what do you think the future holds for newsletters? It's very difficult to predict, and of course, newsletters will adapt with the times. Maybe this is a question for Alan. How do you see the model evolving?
Yeah, it's kind of like what I was saying earlier. The format will change, and the personalities will remain, and their points of view will carry forward. Erin, it's time to do that podcast, and Tanmoy, time to write that script for Netflix. I think this is the beauty of the creator space, because as Erin was saying earlier, you see a lot of collaboration. People are more willing to work with each other because it's not meant to be competitive. It's all meant to be amplifying, and everyone's there to help each other build. No one feels like this is something to protect, or you're on my turf, I'm on your turf. I remember what it was like working in traditional media, where it was all like, oh, well, that other company is going to scoop us now if you're not fast enough with this headline. Nothing like that exists in the creator space. And I'm really, really thankful to have Erin and Tanmoy, leading the way on this one.
Right. And as a FCC tradition, normally at the end of our panel events, we'll ask our panelists to recommend something that they're reading. But I think that maybe we could put a bit of a twist on this, and maybe recommend a newsletter that you've read recently, or something, maybe not even a newsletter, something that you could recommend. And it could be well known, or it could be a bit more niche. Is there anything that you three would recommend to our audience tonight?
I'd like to give a shout out to Slow News Day Substack. The Philippines is just started kicking off their presidential election next year. And it's written by Jonathan Dos Santos, who's one of the best journalists in all of Manila, I think. And it's already dramatic and already crazy. And he's the guy to stick with, I think. And so if you're interested, get onto his work.
I'd have given a shout out to Alan, but he doesn't need my shout out. I would say, yeah, one piece that I keep revisiting almost weekly is The Privatization of Stress by Mark Fisher. He was a British sociologist. And that kind of, I think, informs everything that I do, the philosophy of mental health and the interplay with capitalism that he talked about before he very tragically died by suicide himself. So yeah, I highly recommend everybody to read that.
A bit of a nerdy one for me. We've been doing a lot of podcasts lately, you know, as of this year. It's something that we've been learning a lot about and trying to figure out exactly how to do this properly. So I've been listening to a lot of podcasts about podcasting. So really weird kind of meta stuff. One good one's called Podcasting Sucks, which is a really great kind of look at how do you structure a podcast to make it sound better? How do you tweak it better? Something similar is Podcast Engineering Show, which talks about, you know, what kind of plugins do you use? How do you adjust your mics a little bit better? You know, like all of these types of very, very nerdy, very, very niche kind of things. Absolutely love them because, you know, if it wasn't for the pandemic, I would not have known how to edit audio. So here we are.
Well, thank you so much for those suggestions and for joining us tonight. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. But do check out our future events on the FCC website. And thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.